The briefing room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across weathered faces. Major Callista Ghost, Marquez, stood at attention, her flight suit crisp despite the early hour, dark eyes fixed on a point just above the commanding officer's head. The assembled pilots, all male, all skeptical, shifted in their metal chairs like restless predators sensing wounded prey. "Gentlemen," Colonel Pierce announced, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in military aviation, "meet your new squadron leader for Operation Nightfall." The silence shattered into barely suppressed chuckles. Captain Rodriguez, a hotshot with more ego than flight hours, leaned back in his chair. "Sir, with all due respect, we heard about the incident at Groom Lake. Word is she couldn't hit water if she fell out of a boat." The laughter that followed was sharp, cutting. Ghost's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but her posture remained rigid, professional. She'd heard worse, much worse. Colonel Pierce raised a weathered hand. "That's enough." His steel-gray eyes swept the room like radar sweeping for targets. "What you heard was incomplete intelligence, Captain. Major Marquez didn't miss her target at Groom Lake." "Then what happened, sir?" Lieutenant Hayes called out from the back, his voice tinged with barely concealed mockery. Pierce walked to the far wall where a large tactical display showed satellite imagery of a remote desert testing facility. Red circles marked impact points scattered across what appeared to be empty sand. She hit exactly what she aimed for. Look at the far wall. The room's atmosphere shifted like pressure dropping before a storm. Ghost watched as understanding dawned on their faces, skepticism melting into something approaching respect. The far wall of the briefing room displayed classified footage from that day at Groom Lake, footage that would change everything they thought they knew about precision, about warfare, about her. "Operation Nightfall launches at 400 hours, Pierce continued, his voice now deadly serious. "Major Marquez will lead a 6-aircraft formation into hostile territory. Intelligence suggests enemy surface-to-air missile sites have been repositioned along our primary flight corridor. Standard tactics won't work." Ghost finally spoke, her voice steady as locked targeting systems. "Standard tactics assume standard targets, sir. What we're facing requires unconventional solutions." The pilots exchanged glances. Outside, the pre-dawn darkness pressed against bulletproof windows while somewhere in the distance, jet engines whispered promises of violence. Ghost's fingers unconsciously traced the worn patch on her sleeve, a skull wreathed in clouds, with words that would soon carry weight beyond measure. "Death from above." None of them knew yet that within 72 hours, that patch would become legend. None of them understood that the woman they dismissed would rewrite the rules of aerial warfare forever. But they were about to learn. The colonel's next words hung in the air like smoke from spent ammunition. "This mission is voluntary. Anyone who wants out, speak now." Nobody moved. The game had changed and Ghost was holding all the cards. The pre-flight briefing continued in the sterile glow of the operations center, but the energy had shifted fundamentally. Maps spread across aluminum tables showed terrain that looked like the surface of Mars, jagged mountains rising from desert floors, valleys carved by ancient rivers now dry as bone. Ghost traced flight paths with a steady finger while her squadron crowded around, their earlier derision replaced by focused attention. "Primary target is here," she indicated, tapping a satellite image of what appeared to be a fortified compound nestled between 2 ridgelines. "Secondary extraction point is 12 miles northeast. Weather reports indicate clear skies, minimal wind, but thermals rising from the valley floor could affect low-altitude approaches." Lieutenant Hayes studied the topographical data, his brow furrowed. "Ma'am, these SAM sites create overlapping coverage zones. How do we penetrate without taking losses?" Ghost's dark eyes met his. "We don't penetrate, we redirect." She pulled up a new display showing wind patterns, elevation changes, and thermal currents. "Physics, gentlemen. Sometimes the best way through a maze is to make the maze work for you." Captain Rodriguez leaned closer, his skepticism giving way to professional curiosity. Redirect how? Chaff deployment creates radar shadows, Ghost explained, her voice taking on the tone of an experienced instructor. But traditional chaff falls in predictable patterns. What if we could control those patterns using natural atmospheric conditions? The room grew quiet as understanding began to dawn. Ghost continued. At 3:47 hours, thermal inversion over the valley will create a temperature gradient. Deploy chaff at precise altitudes, and air density differences will carry it along specific vectors. Sergeant Murphy, the grizzled weapons systems operator, whistled low. You're talking about using the sky itself as a weapon. Ghost nodded. The atmosphere becomes our ally. While enemy radar tracks false signatures following predictable paths, we approach from vectors they'll never expect. Colonel Pierce observed from the corner, noting how the room's dynamics had transformed. Jokes and snide comments had evaporated, replaced by intense focus and growing respect. These were professional warriors recognizing expertise when they saw it, regardless of its packaging. Time hack in 30 minutes, Ghost announced, checking her chronometer. Equipment check, then final systems review. Questions. Captain Rodriguez raised his hand. Ma'am, about Groom Lake. What really happened out there? Ghost was quiet for a long moment, her fingers again finding that worn patch on her sleeve. When she spoke, her voice carried weight earned through sacrifice. Sometimes precision isn't about hitting what everyone can see. Sometimes it's about hitting what nobody else notices until it's too late. The pilots exchanged glances loaded with new understanding. Outside, the first hints of dawn painted the eastern horizon in shades of copper and steel. Ghost gathered her charts and headed for the door. Gentlemen, she said without turning back, in 4 hours you'll understand why they call me Ghost, and why the enemy should be afraid of shadows. The pre-dawn air tasted of jet fuel and possibility as Ghost walked across the tarmac toward her aircraft, a sleek F-22 Raptor designated Phantom 6. Her crew chief, Master Sergeant Williams, snapped to attention as she approached, but his usual easy smile was replaced by something more serious, professional respect mixed with curiosity. Morning, Major, Williams said, handing her the pre-flight checklist. Birds ready to hunt. Ran diagnostics twice, everything green across the board. Ghost accepted the tablet, her eyes scanning the data with practiced efficiency. Engine parameters optimal. Avionics systems fully operational. Weapons payload configured exactly to specifications. She nodded approval, but Williams caught her attention with a subtle gesture toward the aircraft's nose. Ma'am took the liberty of adding something, he said, pointing to fresh nose art below the cockpit. A ghostly figure emerged from stylized clouds, but this wasn't the typical pin-up art found on military aircraft. This ghost wore pilot wings and carried the fierce expression of a warrior. Beneath it, in precise lettering, Silent Death. Ghost studied the artwork for a moment, then looked at Williams. Sergeant, regulations clearly state. That nose art must be approved by Squadron Command, Williams interrupted gently. Colonel Pierce signed off on it personally at 500 hours, said it was about time this bird looked like it meant business. A slight smile touched Ghost's lips, the first genuine emotion she'd shown since the briefing. She ran her fingers along the aircraft's smooth fuselage, feeling the power contained within its angular frame. This Raptor had been her partner through 17 successful missions, each one building the legend that preceded her to this assignment. The other pilots were arriving now, their own crew chiefs conducting final pre-flight checks. Ghost watched as Captain Rodriguez performed his walk-around inspection, noting how his movements had changed since the briefing. Gone was the casual arrogance, replaced by the methodical precision of a professional preparing for serious combat. Phantom Flight, this is Tower Control, crackled the radio frequency. Weather update shows conditions optimal for planned departure. Winds calm, visibility unlimited. You have priority clearance for immediate takeoff upon completion of pre-flight protocols. Ghost Keter Radio. Tower Control Phantom 6. Roger weather update. Phantom Flight requests taxi clearance to active runway. Phantom 6 cleared to taxi. Godspeed, Major. The formality in the controller's voice carried more than routine professionalism. Word had spread through the base about this mission, about the woman leading it, and about the techniques that were about to be tested in actual combat conditions. Success would validate revolutionary tactics. Failure would be measured in lives lost. Ghost climbed into her cockpit, the familiar embrace of the ejection seat and control systems welcoming her home. Through her canopy, she could see the other 5 aircraft of Phantom Flight preparing for departure. Each pilot was skilled, experienced, dangerous. But today, they would follow her into combat using tactics that existed more in theory than proven practice. As she initiated startup sequences, Ghost thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Years of training, countless hours perfecting techniques others dismissed as impossible, and the incident at Groom Lake that had nearly ended her career before transforming it into something unprecedented. The Pratt & Whitney engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, power building toward the threshold of controlled violence that would carry them into enemy territory. The taxi to the active runway felt like a funeral procession in reverse. Instead of mourning the dead, Phantom Flight was preparing to create them. Ghost's aircraft led the formation, her wingmen following in precise formation spacing. Radio chatter remained minimal, professional, focused on immediate tactical requirements rather than the larger implications of their mission. Phantom 6 Tower Control, you are cleared for takeoff. Winds calm, runway clear, traffic negative. Ghost pushed the throttles forward, feeling 28,000 pounds of thrust pressing her back into her seat as the Raptor accelerated down the concrete ribbon. The world blurred past her canopy until that magical moment when aircraft weight surrendered to aerodynamic lift, and she was airborne, climbing toward a sky that would either crown her with glory or serve as her tomb. Phantom Flight check-in, she called over the radio. Phantom 2, airborne and green. Phantom 3, systems nominal. Phantom 4, ready for business. Phantom 5, locked and loaded. Phantom 6, copies all. Climb to flight level 350. Maintain tactical spread. Radio silence from this point until contact with hostile forces. The 6 aircraft climbed through morning air so clear it seemed crystalline, their formation a deadly constellation against the brightening sky. Below, the civilized world fell away, replaced by the harsh geometry of mountains and desert that marked the approach to contested territory. Ghost checked her navigation systems, confirming their position relative to the planned ingress route. Satellite intelligence indicated enemy radar stations were operating on predictable schedules, their operators complacent after weeks of routine surveillance duties. That complacency would cost them dearly. At 35,000 feet, the curvature of the Earth became visible through her canopy. Up here, the world looked peaceful, beautiful even. It was an illusion Ghost had learned not to trust. Peace was always temporary in her profession. Violence was the constant, requiring eternal vigilance and superior preparation. Phantom 6, Ghost here, she whispered into her oxygen mask, using her call sign for the first time during this mission. It felt right somehow, acknowledging the identity that had carried her through so many successful operations. Time to show them what precision really means. The aircraft continued their climb toward the operational ceiling where thin air and reduced radar signatures would give them every possible advantage. Each pilot knew their role in the complex choreography about to unfold, but none of them fully understood how Ghost planned to turn atmospheric physics into a weapon more effective than missiles or bullets. Behind them, the sun painted the horizon in shades of amber and gold. Ahead lay enemy territory, hostile forces, and the ultimate test of tactics that had never been attempted under actual combat conditions. Ghost's fingers found the flight controls, extensions of her will that would soon dance death across an unsuspecting sky. The point of no return approached rapidly. 40 minutes into the flight, Ghost's heads-up display showed their formation approaching the edge of enemy radar coverage. Intelligence reports indicated 3 overlapping surveillance zones, each one monitored by experienced operators using equipment sophisticated enough to detect traditional stealth approaches. But Ghost wasn't planning a traditional approach. "Phantom Flight, we're entering the chess match," she transmitted on a secure frequency that enemy interceptors couldn't decode. "Remember, we're not hiding from their radar, we're teaching it to lie." Her tactical display showed wind patterns flowing through the mountain valleys ahead, thermal currents rising from sun-heated rock faces, and atmospheric density variations that most pilots viewed as obstacles to be avoided. Ghost saw them as tools to be exploited. "Phantom 2 and 3, execute Maneuver Alpha on my mark," she commanded. "Deploy chaff in sequence pattern Delta 7. Captain Rodriguez, flying as Phantom 2, acknowledged the order with professional crispness. "Phantom 2, ready for chaff deployment." "Phantom 3, standing by," came Lieutenant Hayes's response. Ghost watched her instruments carefully, waiting for the precise moment when atmospheric conditions would align with their tactical requirements. The thermal inversion layer shown on her weather display was building exactly as predicted, creating an invisible highway through the sky that would carry their deception deep into enemy territory. "Mark execute Alpha." 2 aircraft released carefully calculated amounts of radar-reflective chaff into the thermal layer. The metallic strips caught immediately by rising air currents and carried eastward at predictable velocities. On enemy radar screens, it would appear as if a larger formation of aircraft was approaching along the most obvious flight corridor. Meanwhile, Ghost led the remaining 4 aircraft through a diving turn that dropped them below the thermal layer, where different atmospheric conditions would mask their actual approach vector. The maneuver required split-second timing and absolute trust in her calculations of air density, wind speed, and thermal dynamics. "Hostile radar active," reported Phantom 4, monitoring enemy electronic emissions. "Multiple tracking attempts on the chaff signatures. They're buying it." Ghost allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Phase 1 was working exactly as planned. Enemy radar operators were now focused on Phantom targets moving along predictable paths, while the real threat approached from an entirely different direction. Phantom Flight transitioned to Phase 2. Descend to Angels 15, maintain tactical spacing, weapons systems to standby. The formation descended through layers of air that varied in temperature and density like invisible geological strata. Ghost's aircraft shuddered slightly as they passed through turbulence caused by wind shearing over rocky peaks, but her hands remained steady on the controls. This was familiar territory, not geographically, but professionally. She had spent years learning to read the sky like others read books, understanding its moods, exploiting its characteristics. Below them, the enemy compound came into view through the morning haze. Concrete buildings arranged in defensive patterns, communication arrays bristling with antennas, and most importantly, the surface-to-air missile sites that made conventional approaches suicidal. "Target acquisition," Ghost announced quietly. "All aircraft confirm visual contact with primary objective." One by one, her wingmen acknowledged visual contact with the target. What they couldn't see yet was the elegant trap Ghost was preparing to spring, a demonstration of precision that would redefine their understanding of what was possible when physics became a weapon. The compound's defenders had no idea that death was approaching from vectors their equipment couldn't track, guided by atmospheric conditions they didn't understand, delivered by a pilot they had gravely underestimated. Ghost's targeting computer began acquiring locks on specific structures within the compound. Her weapons bay doors remained closed, but internally, systems were preparing for the kind of precision strike that had made her legendary at Groom Lake. The same precision that had been dismissed as luck was about to prove itself on the largest possible stage. 10 miles from the target, Ghost's formation continued their approach through what appeared to be empty sky. Enemy surface-to-air missile systems remained focused on the chaff signatures still moving along the thermal highway, their operators completely unaware that real threats were converging on their position from an entirely different vector. "Phantom flight, weapons hot," Ghost commanded, her voice carrying the calm authority of absolute certainty. "Target assignments per briefing parameters. Remember, this is precision work. We're surgeons, not sledgehammers." Her tactical display showed each aircraft's assigned target within the compound: primary command center for Phantom 6, communications array for Phantom 2, radar installations for Phantom 3 and 4, missile storage facilities for Phantom 5. Phantom 6 would handle the most critical target, the underground bunker where intelligence suggested enemy commanders were coordinating regional defensive operations. The bunker presented unique challenges. Located beneath 20 feet of reinforced concrete, it required not just precision but perfect timing. Ghost would need to exploit a structural vulnerability that existed for exactly 4 seconds during a shift change when blast doors opened to allow personnel movement. "Phantom 6, target acquisition complete," she announced, watching her heads-up display paint the bunker's ventilation shaft with targeting symbols. Intelligence photos had shown this shaft as a weakness in the facility's armor, a narrow opening that provided air circulation to the underground command post. What the intelligence photos hadn't shown, and what Ghost had calculated during mission planning, was that at precisely 8:47 hours local time, atmospheric pressure changes would create a brief downdraft through that shaft. A downdraft strong enough to carry a precisely delivered explosive charge deep into the facility's heart. "Phantom 2, how's your chaff highway holding up?" "Still drawing attention, Phantom 6. Enemy radar has 3 tracking solutions on false targets. They're completely focused on the wrong sky." Ghost smiled inside her oxygen mask. The deception was working perfectly, but the real test was approaching rapidly. In 2 minutes, she would need to demonstrate the kind of precision that had made her career at Groom Lake and nearly destroyed it when observers couldn't believe what they were seeing. Her weapons computer indicated optimal firing solution in 90 seconds. Through her canopy, the compound looked deceptively peaceful, its defenders blissfully unaware that their morning routine was about to be interrupted by physics, precision, and a pilot who had learned to make the impossible look effortless. "All aircraft, final approach vectors," Ghost commanded. 30 seconds to weapons release. This is what we trained for." The sky ahead was about to become a demonstration in applied mathematics, where atmospheric science met military necessity, and where Ghost would prove that precision wasn't about luck. It was about understanding forces that others couldn't see, couldn't measure, couldn't exploit. Her finger moved toward the weapons release switch. The moment of truth was approaching with the inevitability of gravity itself. 5 miles from target, Ghost's heads-up display showed wind vectors, atmospheric pressure gradients, and thermal currents with scientific precision. Her onboard computer had been calculating trajectory solutions for the past 3 minutes, but the final decision would come down to pilot intuition honed through thousands of hours in similar conditions. "Phantom flight, commence final attack run," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the complexity of what she was attempting. "Maintain assigned vectors, weapons release on my command." The compound below was waking up to morning routines, guards changing shifts, personnel moving between buildings, communication technicians monitoring systems that were about to fail catastrophically. Ghost could see figures moving through the facility's courtyards, completely unaware that death was approaching from 30,000 feet above at nearly twice the speed of sound. Phantom 6, hostile radar has acquired our general vicinity, reported Phantom 4. They're starting to realize the chaff signatures aren't behaving like real aircraft. Ghost nodded inside her helmet. The deception had worked perfectly for Phase 1, but enemy operators were beginning to notice inconsistencies in the false target's flight patterns. Soon, they would expand their search patterns and discover the real threat. Acknowledged Phantom 4, time to make them irrelevant. Her targeting computer showed optimal weapons release in 25 seconds. The bunker's ventilation shaft appeared as a tiny opening in her display, but Ghost's calculations accounted for wind drift, air density, gravitational effects, and the precise timing of the downdraft that would carry her ordnance into the facility's heart. At Groom Lake, observers had called it impossible when she'd threaded a practice round through a 12-inch opening from 8 miles away in 40-knot crosswinds. They demanded repeated demonstrations, convinced the first success was luck. By the 5th consecutive bullseye, they'd stopped calling it luck and started calling it something else entirely. 15 seconds to weapons release, Ghost announced. All aircraft confirm ready status. Phantom 2 ready. Phantom 3 ready. Phantom 4 ready. Phantom 5 ready. Ghost's finger hovered over the release switch. Through her canopy, she could see thermal currents rising from the compound's heated surfaces, air movements invisible to everyone else but clear as daylight to someone who had learned to read atmospheric conditions like sheet music. 10 seconds, 5, 4, 3, 2. At the precise moment when atmospheric pressure, wind vector, and thermal dynamics aligned perfectly with her calculations, Ghost released her ordnance. The guided bomb separated from her aircraft with mechanical precision, its fins immediately adjusting to maintain optimal trajectory through the complex airspace. "Weapons away," she announced calmly. "All aircraft execute immediate egress pattern Charlie." What happened next would be etched into military aviation history. Ghost's bomb, guided by precision electronics but enabled by her understanding of atmospheric physics, descended through layers of air with varying density and temperature. Each layer affected its trajectory slightly, but these effects had been calculated and compensated for during mission planning. At 8,000 feet, the bomb encountered the thermal downdraft Ghost had predicted. Instead of fighting against the air current, the weapon rode it like a river, carried directly toward the bunker's ventilation shaft with an accuracy that defied conventional understanding of long-range precision strikes. The explosion that followed wasn't particularly large. Ghost had selected ordnance designed for penetration rather than blast effect. But the bomb had been delivered with such precision that it traveled through the ventilation system and detonated inside the underground command center, exactly where enemy commanders had thought themselves safe. Secondary explosions followed as stored ammunition and fuel caught fire, sending pillars of black smoke rising into the morning sky like funeral pyres. "Direct hit Phantom 6, confirmed Phantom 2, his voice carrying newfound respect. Target destroyed." The simultaneous strikes on secondary targets had been equally successful. Ghost had led her formation in a demonstration of precision warfare that transformed theoretical tactics into devastating reality. The compound below was burning, its defensive systems neutralized, its command structure eliminated. As Phantom Flight climbed away from the target area, enemy radar operators finally realized they had been tracking phantoms while real aircraft devastated their facility. But by then, Ghost and her wingmen were already disappearing into the vast sky, leaving behind only smoke and the legend of what was possible when science met warfare. "Tower Control, this is Phantom 6, Ghost transmitted as they approached friendly airspace. "Mission accomplished. All aircraft returning with full crew status." The radio crackled with the controller's response. Phantom 6, outstanding work. You have priority landing clearance and, ma'am, there are some very impressed people waiting to speak with you. Ghost smiled inside her oxygen mask. The laughter from the briefing room seemed like it had happened years ago instead of hours. She had a feeling the reception committee would be somewhat different this time. Behind them, smoke continued rising from the destroyed compound, a monument to precision, physics, and the woman they had underestimated until it was far too late. The flight home passed in relative silence, each pilot processing what they had witnessed and participated in. Ghost's formation maintained standard tactical spacing while crossing back into friendly territory, but the atmosphere among the aircrew had fundamentally changed. The casual dismissiveness from the morning briefing had been replaced by professional respect earned through demonstrated competence under combat conditions. Phantom Flight, this is Tower Control, came the radio transmission as they approached their home base. Be advised, you have priority landing clearance and distinguished visitors waiting in debrief. Media containment protocols are in effect. Ghost frowned inside her helmet. Media attention was the last thing she wanted, but successful demonstration of revolutionary tactics inevitably attracted interest from outside the military community. The techniques she had employed today would need to be analyzed, documented, and potentially integrated into standard operating procedures across multiple air forces. Roger, Tower Control. Phantom 6 requesting standard approach pattern for 6 aircraft. Negative, Phantom 6. VIP landing protocol authorized. You're cleared for straighten approach to runway 27. Emergency vehicles standing by as precautionary measure only. As they began their descent, Ghost could see the base spread out below them. Hangars, administrative buildings, and the debriefing facilities where she would soon be explaining her tactics to officers who outranked her by multiple pay grades. More importantly, she would need to convince them that what they had witnessed wasn't a lucky accident but a reproducible technique that could be taught to other pilots. Phantom Flight execute landing sequence. 2. You're cleared to land. Captain Rodriguez touched down first, his Raptor settling onto the runway with professional smoothness. Ghost watched his approach, noting how his landing technique had improved even during the few hours since takeoff. Combat had a way of focusing attention on fundamentals that peacetime training sometimes overlooked. One by one, the other aircraft landed successfully. Ghost brought her own Raptor down last, the Pratt & Whitney engines spooling down from their combat-ready shriek to the more subdued whisper of taxi power. Through her canopy, she could see ground crew personnel positioning wheel chocks and preparing external power connections. Master Sergeant Williams was waiting beside her parking spot, his usual easy grin replaced by something approaching awe. As Ghost shut down her engines and began post-flight procedures, she could see him shaking his head in amazement. "Major," he said as she climbed down from the cockpit, "I've been working on these birds for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just pulled off. The precision required for that kind of strike." He trailed off, apparently lacking adequate words. Ghost pulled off her helmet, dark hair matted with sweat from hours of intense concentration. "Sergeant, precision isn't magic. It's physics applied consistently under controlled conditions. The atmosphere follows predictable rules. Once you understand those rules, you can exploit them." Williams nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced that what he had witnessed could be explained by textbook physics alone. "Ma'am, Colonel Pierce wants to see you in the VIP briefing room as soon as you complete post-flight. Says there are some Pentagon folks who flew in specifically to discuss your tactics." Ghost sighed. The real work was just beginning. Demonstrating revolutionary techniques in combat was one thing. Convincing institutional military leadership to adopt them was an entirely different challenge. She had learned from experience that institutional change moved at glacial speed, especially when proposed innovations challenged conventional wisdom. "Tell the colonel I'll be there in 20 minutes," she said, gathering her flight gear. "I need to complete post-flight documentation first." As she walked toward the operations building, Ghost reflected on the morning's events. The mission had succeeded beyond even her most optimistic projections, but success brought new pressures and expectations. Military aviation was a conservative profession for good reasons. Unsuccessful innovations killed people rather than merely embarrassing them. The VIP briefing room buzzed with activity when Ghost entered 25 minutes later. Colonel Pierce stood near a tactical display showing satellite imagery of the destroyed compound, while several officers she didn't recognize studied mission telemetry data on portable computers. Their uniforms carried insignia indicating ranks significantly above her own pay grade. "Major Marquez," Pierce announced as she entered. "Allow me to introduce General Harrison from Pentagon Joint Staff, Colonel Chen from Air Force Weapons School, and Dr. Rebecca Torres from Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency." Ghost snapped to attention, recognizing names she had heard whispered in military aviation circles. These were the people who decided which innovations became doctrine and which disappeared into classified filing cabinets. General Harrison, a thin man with silver hair and intelligent eyes, stood first. "Major, we've been reviewing your mission telemetry for the past hour. What you accomplished today challenges fundamental assumptions about precision strike capabilities." Ghost remained at attention. "Thank you, sir." "At ease, Major," Harrison continued. "We're here to understand your methods, not critique your posture. Please have a seat. We have questions." As Ghost settled into a chair facing the assembled officers, she realized that everything that happened next would determine whether her techniques remained her personal specialty or became tools available to pilots worldwide. The real battle was just beginning, and this time her opponents were armed with budget authority and institutional skepticism rather than surface-to-air missiles. The questions came rapidly and from multiple directions, each officer approaching Ghost's tactics from their particular area of expertise. General Harrison focused on strategic implications, how atmospheric manipulation techniques could affect broader military planning. Colonel Chen wanted technical specifications, exact altitudes, timing sequences, and equipment modifications required for implementation. Dr. Torres represented the scientific perspective, probing the theoretical foundations underlying Ghost's practical applications. "Major, let's start with fundamentals," General Harrison began, consulting notes on his tablet. "Standard precision strike doctrine assumes optimal conditions, clear weather, minimal wind, stable atmospheric pressure. Your technique appears to exploit suboptimal conditions as tactical advantages. Explain the theoretical basis." Ghost leaned forward slightly, her mind organizing years of study and experience into coherent explanation. "Sir, conventional doctrine treats atmospheric conditions as obstacles because we've historically lacked sufficient understanding of their predictable characteristics. Modern weather modeling capabilities allow us to forecast thermal currents, pressure gradients, and wind shear patterns with unprecedented accuracy." She gestured toward the tactical display showing the morning's target area. "Instead of fighting against atmospheric physics, we can harness those same forces to enhance weapons delivery precision. The thermal downdraft I exploited this morning occurs at that location every day at approximately the same time, caused by temperature differentials between the valley floor and surrounding ridge lines." Colonel Chen interrupted with technical questions. "What modifications did you make to standard targeting systems? How do you calculate trajectory solutions when accounting for multiple atmospheric variables?" "No hardware modifications were required," Ghost replied. "The key innovation is software-based, integration of real-time atmospheric data into existing targeting computers. I developed algorithms that translate weather information into trajectory corrections, allowing standard ordnance to follow complex flight paths through varying air densities. Dr. Torres looked up from her own notes. Major, you're describing atmospheric conditions as if they were terrain features that could be mapped and navigated. That suggests a level of predictability that challenges traditional meteorological assumptions. Ghost nodded. Exactly, Doctor. The atmosphere has architecture just like physical terrain. Thermal layers, pressure gradients, wind currents. They create invisible highways and barriers that remain consistent enough for tactical exploitation. The key is understanding that these patterns repeat based on topography, solar heating, and seasonal variations. General Harrison exchanged glances with his colleagues before continuing. Major, if your techniques can be replicated and taught to other pilots, we're looking at potential revolution in precision strike capabilities. However, institutional adoption requires extensive validation. We need to understand failure modes, training requirements, and operational limitations. Ghost had anticipated this line of inquiry. Military leadership was rightfully cautious about innovations that seemed too good to be true. Sir, I've been developing and refining these techniques for 3 years. Success rate in training environments has been 97% when atmospheric conditions fall within predicted parameters. And when conditions fall outside predicted parameters, Colonel Chin asked. Then we revert to standard tactics, Ghost replied simply. The techniques I'm proposing are additions to existing capabilities, not replacements. Pilots would still train on conventional approaches and use atmospheric exploitation only when conditions permit enhanced precision. Dr. Torres leaned forward with interest. Major, have you considered applications beyond precision strike? Your atmospheric manipulation concepts could potentially enhance reconnaissance operations, electronic warfare, or even defensive maneuvering. Ghost smiled slightly. Doctor, what I demonstrated today represents perhaps 10% of what's theoretically possible. Atmospheric science offers tactical opportunities we've barely begun to explore. The room fell quiet as the assembled officers absorbed the implications of her statement. Ghost could see wheels turning behind their eyes as they considered how her innovations might transform their respective areas of responsibility. General Harrison finally broke the silence. Major Marquez, we're going to need detailed technical documentation, training protocols, and comprehensive testing schedules. How quickly can you prepare materials for institutional evaluation? Ghost straightened in her chair. Sir, I've been preparing those materials for months. Complete documentation is available for immediate review. She had spent countless off-duty hours documenting her techniques, knowing that eventual institutional adoption would require extensive written protocols. The materials waiting in her quarters represented 3 years of innovation distilled into teachable format. Outstanding, Harrison replied. We'll want to begin validation testing within 30 days. Can you recommend other pilots capable of learning and implementing your techniques? Ghost thought about her squadron mates, remembering their transformation from skepticism to respect during the morning's mission. Sir, I believe any competent pilot can learn these techniques given proper instruction and adequate practice time. The concepts are advanced, but not beyond the capabilities of current military aviators. Dr. Torres made additional notes before looking up. Major, there's one more question. Your call sign is Ghost. How did you earn that designation? Ghost was quiet for a moment, memories of previous missions and the reputation that had followed her through multiple assignments. Doctor, when you can strike targets that others consider impossible to reach, using methods they can't detect or counter, you tend to become somewhat elusive. The call sign reflects operational reality rather than personal preference. General Harrison stood, indicating the formal portion of the briefing was concluding. Major, you've given us considerable material to evaluate. Expect follow-up contact within 72 hours regarding implementation planning. This could be the beginning of fundamental changes in how we conduct precision operations. As the senior officers filed out of the briefing room, Ghost remained seated, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Her innovations, developed through years of solitary study and practice, were about to be evaluated for adoption across the entire military aviation community. Colonel Pierce approached as the room emptied. "Ghost, I've been in military aviation for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like what you pulled off today. More importantly, I've never seen Pentagon brass move this quickly on tactical innovations. You've got their attention." Ghost nodded thoughtfully. "Sir, attention can be dangerous. Innovation threatens established interests, and established interests have long memories." Pierce smiled. "Major, sometimes the biggest risk is not taking risks. What you've developed could save lives, win conflicts, and advance our national security capabilities. That's worth fighting for." As Ghost left the briefing room and walked across the base toward her quarters, she reflected on the day's events. Morning had begun with skeptical laughter from her squadron mates. Evening was ending with Pentagon generals requesting detailed implementation plans for techniques that could revolutionize military aviation. The real work was just beginning. Technical documentation, training development, validation testing, and institutional politics would determine whether her innovations became standard doctrine or disappeared into classified obscurity. But for the first time in her career, Ghost felt optimistic about the future of atmospheric exploitation in military operations. Above her, the evening sky was clear, thermal currents settling as surface temperatures equalized with altitude. To most people, it was simply empty air. To Ghost, it was an ocean of tactical possibilities waiting to be explored. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight Ghost allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had proven that precision wasn't about luck. It was about understanding forces that others couldn't see, couldn't measure, couldn't exploit. 3 weeks later, Ghost stood before a classroom filled with the Air Force's most experienced pilots. The Advanced Tactics Training Center at Nellis Air Force Base had been transformed into a laboratory for atmospheric exploitation techniques, complete with sophisticated weather modeling equipment and specialized flight simulators that could replicate complex atmospheric conditions. "Gentlemen and ladies," she began, nodding the mix of skepticism and curiosity on their faces, "today we begin training in what I call environmental flight dynamics, the tactical exploitation of atmospheric conditions for enhanced operational effectiveness." The assembled pilots represented the cream of military aviation, squadron leaders, test pilots, and weapons school graduates who had been selected for this experimental program. Unlike her previous squadron's dismissive attitude, these aviators showed professional interest tempered by healthy skepticism about techniques that challenged conventional wisdom. Major Patricia Viper Kelly, a veteran F-16 pilot with over 2,000 combat hours, raised her hand. "Ghost, we've all heard stories about your Groom Lake demonstrations. Before we dive into theory, can you show us what you're talking about? Something we can actually see." Ghost smiled, having anticipated this request. She walked to a tactical display showing real-time weather data from the training ranges surrounding Nellis. "Viper, excellent question. Look at this thermal map from Range 7. The display showed invisible columns of heated air rising from the desert floor, creating vertical highways through the atmosphere that would persist for several more hours as surface temperatures remained elevated. To most pilots, these thermal currents represented turbulence to be avoided. Ghost saw them as tactical opportunities. "In 90 minutes, I'll demonstrate precision ordnance delivery using those thermal currents to enhance accuracy beyond anything achievable through conventional means. But first, you need to understand the physics underlying what appears to be impossible." She clicked to the next display, showing atmospheric cross-sections with temperature gradients marked in different colors. The atmosphere isn't empty space. It's a three-dimensional ocean with currents, layers, and predictable flow patterns. Traditional aviation training teaches us to work around atmospheric conditions. I'm proposing we learn to work with them. Lieutenant Colonel James Hammer Morrison, recently transferred from the Pentagon's Weapons Development Division, leaned forward with interest. Ghost, standard meteorological prediction has limitations. How do you achieve the precision required for tactical exploitation? Ghost had spent considerable time developing her answer to this inevitable question. Hammer, conventional weather forecasting focuses on large-scale patterns across hundreds of miles. Military tactical requirements demand accuracy measured in meters across specific locations. The solution is micrometeorology, detailed analysis of atmospheric conditions within limited geographic areas. She pulled up satellite imagery showing the terrain around their training range, overlaid with wind vector data and thermal gradient measurements. Using topographical analysis combined with real-time atmospheric monitoring, we can predict air movements with sufficient accuracy for tactical application. The key is understanding that local weather patterns repeat based on geographic features. Captain Sarah Phoenix Rodriguez, a recent weapons school graduate, studied the display intently. "Ma'am, this assumes our targets will always be in areas with exploitable atmospheric conditions. What about operations in different geographic regions or weather patterns?" Ghost nodded approvingly. "Phoenix, excellent tactical thinking. You're absolutely right that atmospheric exploitation techniques are geographic and weather dependent. However, most military operations occur in regions with predictable meteorological patterns: deserts, mountains, coastal areas. Each geographic type offers different exploitation opportunities." She clicked through additional displays showing atmospheric analysis from various global regions where military operations typically occurred. Desert operations offer thermal currents and pressure gradients. Mountain regions provide consistent wind patterns and altitude-based atmospheric layers. Coastal areas feature reliable sea-land thermal differentials. The techniques adapt to local conditions. Major Kelly raised another question. "Ghost, training pilots to exploit atmospheric conditions sounds like it requires advanced degrees in meteorology. How do you make this practical for operational squadrons?" Ghost had anticipated this concern as well. Military aviation already demanded extensive technical knowledge from pilots, and adding atmospheric science to their required expertise could prove overwhelming. "Viper, that's why we're developing simplified decision matrices and automated calculation systems. Pilots won't need to become meteorologists. They'll need to recognize atmospheric conditions that can be exploited and know how to apply appropriate techniques." She demonstrated the user interface for the atmospheric analysis computer system that would integrate into existing aircraft avionics. The technology handles complex calculations. Pilots provide tactical decision-making and precise execution. It's similar to how current targeting systems work: sophisticated mathematics hidden behind intuitive interfaces. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison examined the interface closely. "This looks like it could integrate with current heads-up display systems without major modifications. What about training requirements?" "Initial qualification requires 40 hours of classroom instruction followed by 20 flight hours in controlled conditions," Ghost replied. "Proficiency maintenance demands regular practice, but techniques become intuitive with sufficient repetition." The classroom discussion continued for another hour, covering technical details, operational limitations, and implementation challenges. Ghost could see the assembled pilots beginning to grasp the revolutionary implications of atmospheric exploitation, while simultaneously appreciating the complexities involved in practical application. As the formal briefing concluded, Major Kelly approached with additional questions. "Ghost, I've been flying combat missions for 12 years, and I've never encountered anyone who thinks about aviation the way you do. Where did these ideas come from?" Ghost considered her response carefully. "Viper, desperation is an excellent teacher. Early in my career, I was assigned missions that conventional tactics couldn't accomplish. Either I developed new approaches or I failed. Failure wasn't acceptable." She gestured toward the weather displays still showing atmospheric data from the training ranges. "The atmosphere has always contained tactical opportunities. We simply lacked the knowledge and technology to exploit them. Modern computer systems and advanced meteorological understanding have made possible what previous generations of pilots could only dream about." Captain Rodriguez joined the conversation. "Ma'am, what you're describing sounds like it could change fundamental assumptions about air warfare. Have you considered strategic implications beyond precision strikes?" Ghost's expression grew serious. "Phoenix, what we're discussing today represents early applications of much broader concepts. Atmospheric exploitation could eventually affect reconnaissance, electronic warfare, air-to-air combat, and defensive operations. We're opening doors to tactical possibilities that don't exist in current doctrine." As the pilots filed out of the classroom, Ghost remained behind to review notes for the afternoon's practical demonstration. Through the window, she could see aircraft being prepared for the training flights that would prove whether her techniques could be successfully transferred to other aviators. The stakes had escalated significantly since that morning 3 weeks ago when her squadron had dismissed her with laughter. Now, she was responsible for training pilots who would carry these innovations back to operational squadrons worldwide. Success would revolutionize military aviation. Failure would end her career and potentially cost lives in future conflicts. Ghost gathered her materials and headed toward the flight line, where the real test of her theories was about to begin. In the distance, thermal currents were building over the desert floor, creating invisible highways through the sky that would either validate her innovations or expose their limitations. The afternoon demonstration flight launched under perfect conditions for atmospheric exploitation. Clear skies allowed maximum solar heating of the desert surface, generating predictable thermal currents that Ghost's computer models had been tracking since sunrise. 6 aircraft participated in the exercise, Ghost flying as primary demonstrator, while 5 student pilots observed her techniques firsthand. "Academic flight, this is Ghost," she transmitted as their formation climbed toward the operational area. "Today's lesson is practical application of thermal current manipulation for enhanced weapons delivery. Observe my approach vectors and note how atmospheric conditions affect trajectory solutions." The target was a simulated enemy installation on Range 7, complete with mock buildings and defensive positions that allowed realistic training without actual ordnance expenditure. Practice bombs would measure accuracy, while telemetry systems recorded atmospheric data for post-flight analysis. "Ghost, Academic 2, came Major Kelly's voice over the radio. "Thermal displays show significant updrafts over the target area. How do you plan to exploit those conditions?" Ghost checked her atmospheric analysis computer, which showed 3 distinct thermal columns rising from the desert floor at predictable intervals. "Academic 2, observe my approach pattern. Instead of fighting against the thermal activity, I'm going to use it as a delivery system." She banked her F-16 into a diving turn that positioned her aircraft above the strongest thermal current, then released her practice ordnance directly into the rising column of heated air. The bomb, instead of following a ballistic trajectory, was carried upward by the thermal before gravity reasserted control and guided it toward the target with enhanced accuracy. "Direct hit," confirmed the range control officer. "Ghost, your practice bomb landed within 2 meters of target center. Academic flight, did you observe the technique?" One by one, the student pilots acknowledged what they had witnessed. Ghost's bomb had followed an impossible trajectory, rising initially before descending toward the target with precision that defied conventional understanding of weapons delivery. Academic flight, that was thermal enhancement, Ghost explained. The rising air column provided additional lift that extended range and improved accuracy. Now observe thermal deflection. Her second approach demonstrated a different technique, using thermal currents to alter the practice bomb's trajectory in flight. By releasing the ordnance at the edge of a thermal column, she caused it to curve around the heated air mass before striking a target that had been hidden behind terrain features. "Impossible," muttered Captain Rodriguez over the radio. "Ghost, that bomb changed direction in mid-flight." "Phoenix, physics made it change direction," Ghost corrected gently. "I simply provided initial conditions that allowed atmospheric forces to guide the weapon along the desired path. The thermal current acted like a river flowing through the sky." The demonstration continued for 90 minutes, with Ghost showcasing multiple variations of atmospheric exploitation: thermal riding for extended range, pressure gradient manipulation for enhanced accuracy, wind shear exploitation for trajectory modification. Each technique built upon the previous demonstration, creating a comprehensive display of environmental flight dynamics. Major Kelly attempted the first student replication, her F-16 approaching a thermal column with careful precision. Ghost, Academic 2 beginning thermal enhancement approach. Atmospheric computer shows optimal release conditions in 15 seconds. Ghost monitored Kelly's approach through her own displays, noting the slight hesitation that indicated the veteran pilot wasn't entirely comfortable with the unconventional technique. Academic 2, trust your instruments. The thermal signature is solid and predictable. Kelly released her practice ordnance into the thermal current, but her timing was slightly off. The bomb rose with the heated air but didn't achieve the precision Ghost had demonstrated. Still, it struck within 10 meters of target center, respectable accuracy by conventional standards. Academic 2, good initial attempt, Ghost transmitted. Your timing was conservative. Thermal exploitation requires aggressive precision. You must release at the optimal moment regardless of conventional wisdom telling you it's wrong. Captain Rodriguez made the next attempt, her approach more confident than Kelly's had been. Ghost, Academic 3 beginning approach. I'm seeing the thermal signature, but it's counterintuitive to release ordnance into rising air. Phoenix, trust the physics, Ghost replied. The mathematics don't care about intuition. Rodriguez's bomb followed a trajectory very similar to Ghost's demonstration, rising initially before curving down toward the target with enhanced accuracy. Her impact was within 4 meters of target center, excellent results for a first attempt at thermal exploitation. Outstanding, Academic 3, Ghost acknowledged. You're beginning to understand the relationship between atmospheric conditions and weapons delivery. The remaining student pilots completed their attempts with varying degrees of success, each one improving their understanding of how thermal currents could enhance conventional tactics. By the end of the training flight, all 5 aviators had successfully demonstrated basic thermal exploitation techniques. Academic flight, return to base, Ghost commanded as the afternoon sun began lowering toward the western horizon. Excellent work today. You've taken the first steps toward mastering environmental flight dynamics. During the flight home, the radio chatter among student pilots revealed excitement mixed with professional skepticism. They had witnessed and partially replicated techniques that challenged everything they thought they knew about precision weapons delivery. But years of conventional training created psychological resistance to accepting revolutionary innovations. Ghost, Academic 2, Major Kelly transmitted. What we did today, is this really reproducible under combat conditions? The thermal pattern seemed almost too convenient. Ghost had expected this question and had prepared her response carefully. Academic 2, Today's conditions were selected specifically because they provided optimal learning opportunities. However, exploitable atmospheric conditions exist in most operational environments. The key is recognizing and adapting to whatever conditions are present. As they approached Nellis Air Force Base, Ghost reflected on the afternoon's success. 5 experienced pilots had successfully demonstrated basic atmospheric exploitation on their first attempts. With additional training and practice, they would master techniques that could revolutionize precision warfare. But questions remained about institutional adoption, operational integration, and the countless variables that separated training success from combat effectiveness. The techniques worked under controlled conditions. The ultimate test would come when pilots attempted atmospheric exploitation during actual combat operations against real enemies who could shoot back. The landing pattern that evening felt different from previous training flights. Ghost was no longer an individual innovator working in isolation. She was now an instructor responsible for transferring revolutionary techniques to pilots who would carry them into harm's way. The responsibility felt heavier than anything she had experienced during her own combat operations. As the sun set behind the Nevada mountains, thermal currents began dissipating into the cooling evening air. Tomorrow would bring new weather patterns, different atmospheric conditions, and continued challenges in transforming theoretical innovations into practical military capabilities. But tonight, Ghost allowed herself quiet satisfaction in knowing that 5 more pilots understood the sky as something more than empty space through which aircraft traveled. They were beginning to see it as she did, an ocean of tactical possibilities waiting to be exploited by those with sufficient knowledge and courage to challenge conventional wisdom. The revolution in environmental flight dynamics had taken another significant step forward. 6 months after the initial demonstration at Nellis, Ghost found herself standing in the Pentagon's most secure briefing room, facing an audience that included the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, and representatives from allied nations' military aviation communities. The walls displayed classified imagery from combat operations, where atmospheric exploitation techniques had been successfully employed by pilots trained in her methods. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Harrison announced, "Major Marquez will brief you on the operational results of the Environmental Flight Dynamics Program since its implementation across multiple theater commands." Ghost approached the podium with the same calm confidence that had carried her through countless combat missions. The audience before her represented the highest levels of military leadership, but the principles she would discuss remained grounded in the physics and practical application she had spent years perfecting. "Honorable Secretary, General Officers, distinguished guests," she began. "In the past 6 months, pilots trained in atmospheric exploitation techniques have conducted 237 precision strikes with a success rate of 94%, 12% higher than conventional methods achieved under similar conditions." The briefing room's main display showed a world map with mission locations marked in green for successful operations and red for missions that had encountered significant difficulties. The pattern was unmistakable. Atmospheric exploitation techniques had proven effective across diverse geographic regions and weather conditions. Secretary of Defense Williams leaned forward with interest. "Major, those are impressive statistics, but I'm more concerned about operational flexibility. Can these techniques be employed when conventional methods would fail entirely?" Ghost clicked to the next display, showing detailed analysis of 3 recent operations where atmospheric conditions had been initially considered prohibitive for precision strikes. "Mr. Secretary, Operation Desert Phoenix demonstrated thermal manipulation in high wind conditions previously thought impossible for accurate weapons delivery. The pilot used crosswind thermal gradients to enhance accuracy rather than fighting against them." She continued through additional case studies, each one demonstrating how environmental flight dynamics had enabled success where conventional tactics would have failed or required significantly larger force deployments. The cumulative effect was compelling evidence that atmospheric exploitation represented genuine revolutionary advancement rather than marginal improvement. General Morrison, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, studied the operational data carefully. Major, these results suggest your techniques could reduce required force sizes for precision operations. What are the strategic implications? Ghost had anticipated this line of inquiry from strategic-level leadership. Sir, smaller force requirements mean reduced logistics footprints, decreased operational exposure, and enhanced mission security. Single aircraft can now accomplish objectives that previously required multiple plane formations. The discussion that followed covered budgetary implications, training expansion requirements, and integration with existing operational doctrine. Ghost found herself defending techniques that 6 months earlier had been dismissed as impossible, but which now generated enthusiasm among senior leadership recognizing their strategic value. Admiral Chen, Chief of Naval Operations, raised questions about maritime applications. Major, your demonstrations have focused on land-based operations. Can these techniques be adapted for carrier-based aviation or operations over water? Ghost smiled, having spent considerable time developing maritime applications during recent training cycles. Admiral, oceanic atmospheric conditions offer unique exploitation opportunities. Sea surface thermal differentials create predictable wind patterns, while coastal operations benefit from consistent land-sea thermal gradients. She demonstrated maritime atmospheric analysis using real-time data from training operations conducted off the California coast. The displays showed thermal boundaries between ocean temperatures and coastal land masses, creating vertical highways through the atmosphere that could be exploited for enhanced precision or extended range. Outstanding potential, Admiral Chen acknowledged. We'll want to begin carrier qualification training as soon as possible. The briefing continued for 2 hours, covering technical details, resource requirements, and implementation timelines for expanding atmospheric exploitation training across all military aviation communities. Ghost answered questions about advanced techniques still under development, international training cooperation, and potential countermeasures that enemy forces might employ. As the formal briefing concluded, Secretary Williams approached with final questions. Major, you've demonstrated that individual innovation can revolutionize military capabilities when properly supported and developed. What advice would you offer to other innovators working on unconventional solutions? Ghost considered her response carefully, thinking about the journey from initial skepticism through current institutional adoption. Mr. Secretary, innovation requires persistence in the face of skepticism, rigorous validation of theoretical concepts, and willingness to accept that revolutionary ideas often appear impossible until they're proven practical. She gestured toward the displays still showing successful mission results from around the world. More importantly, innovation must serve operational necessity rather than academic curiosity. The techniques we've developed solve real problems faced by pilots in actual combat situations. Secretary Williams nodded approvingly. Major, your work exemplifies the kind of thinking our military needs to maintain technological and tactical superiority. Expect continued institutional support for expanding these capabilities. As senior leadership filed out of the briefing room, Ghost remained behind to organize her materials and reflect on how dramatically her professional situation had changed. 6 months ago, she had been an individual innovator working in relative obscurity. Today, her techniques were being implemented across multiple military aviation communities worldwide. General Harrison approached as the room emptied. Ghost, I have one final question that didn't seem appropriate for public discussion. Are there other innovations you've been developing that we should know about? Ghost's expression grew serious. Sir, atmospheric exploitation represents perhaps 20% of what's theoretically possible when we fully integrate environmental science with military aviation. I've been working on applications involving electromagnetic phenomena, gravitational effects, and quantum mechanics principles. Harrison's eyebrows rose. Major, that sounds like science fiction. Ghost smiled slightly. Sir, 6 months ago, using thermal currents to enhance weapons accuracy sounded like science fiction too. The boundary between impossible and inevitable is often smaller than we assume. As Ghost left the Pentagon that evening, she reflected on the responsibility that came with revolutionary innovation. Thousands of pilots worldwide were now employing techniques she had developed through years of solitary study and experimentation. Their success and their survival depended on the accuracy and reliability of her methods. But beyond immediate operational applications, Ghost recognized that environmental flight dynamics represented the beginning of a fundamental transformation in how military aviation integrated with natural phenomena. Future innovations would push boundaries even further, potentially redefining the relationship between human technology and environmental forces. Above Washington, D.C., evening thermal currents were settling as urban heat dissipated into the cooling night air. To most observers, it was simply empty sky. To Ghost, it represented an ocean of possibilities that humanity was just beginning to explore and exploit. The revolution in environmental flight dynamics had achieved institutional acceptance. Now it was time to push the boundaries even further into territory that currently existed only in theoretical speculation and carefully guarded research programs. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new innovations, and new opportunities to transform the impossible into the inevitable. 2 years after her Pentagon briefing, Ghost stood on the observation deck of the Experimental Flight Test Center at Edwards Air Force Base, watching the dawn sky through reinforced windows that had witnessed decades of aviation history. Below her, technicians prepared an aircraft that represented the culmination of everything she had learned about atmospheric exploitation, and the beginning of innovations that would push those concepts far beyond anything previously imagined. The XF-47, Atmospheric Phantom, incorporated environmental flight dynamics into its basic design, rather than treating atmospheric conditions as external factors to be overcome. Its adaptive wing surfaces could alter their configuration in real time to exploit thermal currents, pressure gradients, and electromagnetic phenomena. The aircraft didn't fight against atmospheric conditions, it danced with them. Ghost, this is Tower Control, came the radio transmission. XF-47 is cleared for first atmospheric integration test flight. Weather conditions are optimal for full-spectrum environmental exploitation. Ghost keyed her radio from the observation deck. Tower Control, Ghost acknowledging, beginning final system checks. 3 years of development had transformed her atmospheric exploitation techniques from manual pilot skills into automated aircraft capabilities. The XF-47's computer systems could analyze environmental conditions and automatically adjust flight characteristics to optimize performance beyond anything achievable through human pilot input alone. Dr. Rebecca Torres, now serving as Director of Advanced Aviation Research, joined Ghost at the observation windows. Major, today's test flight represents the most significant advancement in military aviation since the development of stealth technology. Are you ready? Ghost nodded, her attention focused on the sleek aircraft waiting on the runway below. Doctor, we're about to discover whether 3 years of theoretical development translates into practical capability. The XF-47 either validates everything we've learned about environmental integration, or it demonstrates the limitations of current technology. The experimental aircraft began its takeoff roll, accelerating smoothly down the runway until its adaptive wings automatically adjusted for optimal lift generation in current atmospheric conditions. Instead of the conventional transition from ground effect to sustained flight, the XF-47 seemed to flow into the air like a creature native to the sky. XF-47, this is Edwards Control, transmitted the tower. You are airborne and cleared for test profile Alpha. All telemetry systems are green. Ghost watched through high-powered binoculars as her aircraft climbed toward its operational altitude, adaptive wing surfaces, continuously adjusting to exploit thermal currents and pressure gradients that conventional aircraft would either avoid or fight against. The XF-47 treated atmospheric turbulence as energy sources rather than obstacles. Edwards Control, XF-47 beginning atmospheric integration sequence, came the transmission from the test pilot, Colonel Marcus Vortex Thompson, one of the most experienced aviators in the experimental flight program, switching to full environmental exploitation mode. What happened next would be discussed in aviation circles for decades. Instead of following a conventional climb profile, the XF-47 began riding thermal currents like an eagle, gaining altitude through atmospheric lift rather than pure engine power. Its fuel consumption dropped by 30%, while its climb rate increased beyond anything achievable through conventional means. "Impossible," whispered Dr. Torres, studying telemetry displays that showed the aircraft's performance parameters. The XF-47 is exceeding theoretical maximum efficiency by margins our models suggested were unattainable. Ghost smiled, remembering the similar reactions when she had first demonstrated basic thermal exploitation techniques years earlier. "Doctor, we're discovering that our theoretical models were too conservative. The atmosphere contains more exploitable energy than we calculated." Colonel Thompson's voice crackled over the radio with excitement barely contained within professional protocols. Edwards Control, XF-47, has achieved operational altitude using 60% normal fuel consumption. Adaptive wing systems are automatically optimizing for current atmospheric conditions. This aircraft flies like nothing I've ever experienced. The test flight continued for 2 hours, during which the XF-47 demonstrated capabilities that redefined aviation possibilities. Electromagnetic field detection allowed the aircraft to exploit atmospheric electrical phenomena for enhanced performance. Gravitational gradient analysis enabled flight path optimization through three-dimensional space in ways that conventional navigation systems couldn't achieve. Most significantly, the XF-47's atmospheric integration systems began learning and adapting beyond their original programming. The aircraft's artificial intelligence started recognizing environmental patterns that hadn't been included in its initial database, expanding its exploitation capabilities autonomously. XF-47, Edwards Control, transmitted the tower as the test flight neared completion. "Prepare for landing approach. Runway conditions are standard, winds calm." Colonel Thompson's response carried amazement that professional aviators rarely allowed into official communications. Edwards Control, requesting permission for atmospheric-assisted landing approach. XF-47 systems are indicating optimal thermal conditions for enhanced precision touchdown. Ghost exchanged glances with Dr. Torres. Even the landing phase was revealing new possibilities for atmospheric exploitation. The XF-47 wasn't just an aircraft. It was becoming a demonstration of how human technology could achieve symbiosis with natural phenomena. The landing that followed appeared almost supernatural. Instead of the controlled crash that characterized conventional aircraft touchdowns, the XF-47 settled onto the runway with precision that seemed to defy physics. Thermal management and pressure gradient exploitation allowed touchdown accuracy measured in centimeters rather than meters. "Edwards Control, XF-47 is on the ground," Colonel Thompson announced. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have just witnessed the future of aviation." As ground crews secured the experimental aircraft, Ghost reflected on the journey that had brought her from squadron skepticism to revolutionary innovation. The XF-47 represented validation of concepts that had once been dismissed as impossible, but more importantly, it demonstrated that human innovation could transcend traditional limitations when supported by sufficient understanding and advanced technology. Dr. Torres began reviewing telemetry data from the test flight, her expression revealing excitement about possibilities that extended far beyond military aviation. Ghost, the environmental integration techniques demonstrated today have applications for commercial aviation, space exploration, and atmospheric research. We're looking at transformational technology with implications across multiple industries. Ghost nodded, but her thoughts remained focused on the military applications that had driven her initial innovations. Doctor, the XF-47 changes fundamental assumptions about air superiority, precision strikes, and reconnaissance operations. Enemy forces will need to develop entirely new countermeasures for aircraft that can exploit atmospheric conditions they can't detect or predict. As the sun set behind the California mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson, Ghost considered the responsibilities that came with revolutionary innovation. The techniques she had developed in solitude were now being integrated into aircraft systems that could autonomously exploit environmental phenomena beyond human perception or reaction time. The transformation from individual pilot skills to automated aircraft capabilities represented a quantum leap in military aviation, but it also raised questions about the evolving relationship between human operators and increasingly intelligent machines. Future pilots would need to understand their role in a partnership with artificial intelligence systems capable of exploiting environmental conditions faster and more precisely than human reflexes allowed. But those were concerns for tomorrow. Tonight, Ghost allowed herself quiet satisfaction in knowing that the impossible had once again become inevitable through persistence, innovation, and willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. The sky above Edwards Air Force Base was clear, thermal currents dissipating as surface temperatures equalized with altitude. To most observers, it was empty space through which aircraft traveled. To Ghost and the XF-47, it had become a three-dimensional ocean of tactical opportunities waiting to be explored and exploited. The revolution in environmental flight dynamics had achieved its next evolutionary step. The future promised innovations that would push boundaries even further into territory that currently existed only in theoretical speculation and classified research programs that pushed the very limits of what physics suggested might be possible. 5 years after the XF-47's first flight, Ghost found herself in a place she had never expected, the Oval Office, standing beside the President of the United States as he signed legislation establishing the Environmental Flight Dynamics Command as a permanent branch of the United States Space Force. The ceremony was private, classified at levels that ensured the general public would never know the full scope of capabilities their military now possessed. "Major, excuse me, Colonel Marquez," the President said with a smile as he completed his signature. "Your innovations have fundamentally transformed not just military aviation, but our understanding of what's possible when human ingenuity meets natural phenomena. The techniques you pioneered are now protecting American interests in ways the public will hopefully never need to fully appreciate." Ghost, now wearing the silver oak leaves of a full colonel, maintained her characteristic composure despite the magnitude of the moment. "Mr. President, the real credit belongs to the thousands of pilots, engineers, and scientists who transformed individual innovations into institutional capabilities. Environmental flight dynamics succeeded because it solved real problems faced by people in dangerous situations." Secretary of Defense Martinez, present for the signing ceremony, consulted his briefing materials before addressing the President. "Sir, Colonel Marquez's techniques are now employed by pilots in 17 allied nations. The strategic implications extend far beyond American military capabilities. We're looking at fundamental changes in how democratic nations maintain technological superiority. The president nodded thoughtfully. Colonel, I understand there are even more advanced applications under development that couldn't be discussed in today's ceremony. How far do you believe environmental integration can be pushed? Ghost had spent considerable time preparing for this inevitable question. Mr. President, atmospheric exploitation represents early applications of much broader concepts. Current research programs are investigating quantum-level environmental interactions, electromagnetic field manipulation, and gravitational gradient exploitation. The boundary between science fiction and military capability continues shifting in directions that challenge traditional assumptions. Through the Oval Office windows, Washington, D.C. spread out under an autumn sky that appeared peaceful to casual observation. Ghost knew that above the city, invisible to conventional detection systems, next-generation aircraft were conducting training operations using atmospheric integration techniques that would have seemed impossible just 5 years earlier. The meeting concluded with discussions of budget allocations, international cooperation agreements, and classification protocols for protecting innovations that provided unprecedented strategic advantages. As the president's staff began clearing the room, Ghost reflected on the journey that had brought her from squadron mockery to presidential recognition. Dr. Torres, now serving as scientific advisor for advanced military technologies, approached as the formal ceremony ended. Ghost, there's one more development I need to brief you on privately. Our deep research programs have identified phenomena that extend beyond atmospheric exploitation into areas that challenge conventional understanding of physics itself. Ghost's expression grew serious. Throughout her career, each breakthrough had revealed new possibilities that pushed boundaries further than anyone had initially imagined. Doctor, how far beyond conventional understanding? Torres glanced around to ensure their conversation couldn't be overheard. Ghost, we're detecting environmental interactions that suggest the atmosphere isn't just a medium through which aircraft travel. It may be a component of larger systems that extend into space, time, and dimensional frameworks that current science is only beginning to comprehend. As they left the Oval Office and walked through corridors where American history had been shaped by countless decisions, Ghost considered the implications of Torres' statement. Her innovations had begun with simple observations about thermal currents and wind patterns. Now she was being briefed on phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality itself. Doctor, are we approaching the limits of what human technology can safely exploit? Or are we discovering that those limits exist in our understanding rather than in the phenomena themselves? Torres smiled with the expression of someone who had spent years grappling with questions that had no easy answers. Ghost, that's exactly the right question to ask, and it's why your next assignment will take you beyond anything we've previously attempted. That evening, Ghost stood on the roof of her Pentagon apartment, looking up at stars that seemed closer than they had appeared during her childhood in rural Nevada. The city lights of Washington, D.C. created their own atmospheric phenomena, heat islands, electromagnetic disturbances, and pressure variations that her trained eyes could now recognize and analyze. Above her, invisible to conventional observation, she knew that aircraft were flying missions using techniques she had pioneered. Pilots trained in environmental flight dynamics were conducting operations that protected national security through capabilities that potential adversaries couldn't detect, couldn't counter, and couldn't comprehend. But beyond current applications, Ghost sensed that her journey into atmospheric exploitation had been preparation for challenges and opportunities that extended far beyond anything previously imagined. The conversation with Dr. Torres suggested that environmental integration might be a stepping stone toward understanding forces that operated on scales both larger and smaller than conventional military planning typically considered. Her call sign, Ghost, had originally reflected her ability to strike targets that seemed impossible to reach using methods that couldn't be detected or countered. Now it seemed prophetic in ways she was only beginning to understand. The techniques she had developed were revealing aspects of reality that existed between the visible and the theoretical, between the possible and the impossible. Tomorrow would bring new assignments, new challenges, and new opportunities to push the boundaries of what human innovation could achieve when supported by sufficient understanding and advanced technology. But tonight, Ghost allowed herself a moment of quiet pride in knowing that she had transformed impossibility into inevitability through persistence, precision, and willingness to see the sky not as empty space, but as an ocean of tactical possibilities. The revolution in environmental flight dynamics had achieved institutional permanence. The future promised discoveries that would push human capabilities into territories that currently existed only in the realm of theoretical speculation and classified programs that operated at the very edges of known science. Above her, the stars continued their ancient patterns, apparently unchanged by human innovation. But Ghost now knew that appearance could be deceiving. The universe contained forces and phenomena that human technology was only beginning to exploit, and her journey into environmental integration had been preparation for challenges that would test the very limits of what courage, knowledge, and determination could accomplish. The story of Ghost's innovations would continue, but its next chapters would be written in languages that current science was still learning to speak, in territories that maps had not yet charted, using capabilities that challenged the boundary between the possible and the miraculous. Her legend was complete, but her mission was just beginning.